The festival contract was clear. Bob Dylan would close the second night. He had made that a condition of his appearance. Non-negotiable, his team had said, before anyone even discussed the fee. Bob Dylan does not open for anyone. Bob Dylan does not set the stage for someone else to walk out and inherit the crowd. That was simply not how it worked. It had never worked that way. The organizer, a man named Patrick Hale, who had spent 11 years booking festivals across the Pacific Northwest, had agreed without hesitation. Of course, Dylan closes. Nobody argued with that. The festival was called Cascadia Sound, a 3-day outdoor event held in a field outside Olympia, Washington, in August of 1993. It was not the biggest festival in the country. It was not the most prestigious. But it had cultivated something rare, a reputation for genuine curation, for lineups that didn't feel assembled by committee. Hale had built it slowly, year by year, and by 1993 it had enough credibility to attract names that surprised people. Dylan had agreed to headline Saturday night. The conversation had taken 3 months and 2 intermediaries, but it had happened. Nirvana had been added to the Saturday lineup 6 weeks before the event. Nobody on Dylan's team had flagged it as a problem. Why would they? Nirvana was a rock band, a loud one. They belonged earlier in the evening, in the slot that warmed the crowd up and spent itself before the headliner arrived. That was the natural order. That was how festivals worked. You put the energy act in the middle, let them burn, and then the legend comes out at the end and reminds everyone what music actually is. The schedule had Nirvana on at 8:30, Dylan at 10. Patrick Hale had organized it that way because it made sense logistically. He had not thought deeply about what it meant. He was thinking about stage transitions, sound checks, the catering situation that had been a problem since Thursday morning. Dylan arrived at the festival site at 5 in the afternoon with a small entourage. He walked the grounds briefly, spoke with his sound engineer, and retreated to the artist hospitality area, a converted barn set back from the main stage, divided into separate sections by hanging fabric and temporary walls. He was quiet. He usually was in the hours before a show. His people had learned not to interpret that silence as anything other than what it was: preparation. Nirvana arrived at 6. Kurt Cobain came in last. The rest of the band had already made their way to the backstage compound when Kurt's car pulled up. He was wearing a green cardigan that had seen better years, jeans and a pair of shoes that looked like they'd been bought at a Goodwill and then left in the rain. His hair was unwashed. He looked like someone who had not slept enough and was not especially bothered by that fact. One of the festival's production assistants, a 22-year-old named Simone Reyes, was assigned to escort the band from their vehicles to the compound. She walked Kurt across the field, past the generator rigs and the cable runs, and the smell of something frying from the food vendor section. He looked at all of it with mild, quiet interest. Not excitement, not performance, just looking. He didn't say much. He asked her if there was coffee. She said yes. He said thanks. She would remember later that he had paused once, halfway across the field, to look up at the sky. Just a second. Then he kept walking. That was the whole conversation. The 2 sections of the backstage compound were separated by perhaps 40 feet and a wall of black curtain. Dylan's side had been set up with more care, better furniture, better lighting, a specific brand of tea someone on his team had requested. Nirvana's side was fine, functional. For the first 2 hours, the 2 parties did not interact. This was not unusual. Festival backstages operated on an unspoken system of territorial courtesy. You stayed in your section. You didn't wander. You didn't intrude on another artist's preparation unless there was a reason. There was no reason, and so no one crossed the 40 feet. At around 7:30, Patrick Hale came to speak with Dylan's team about the evening's running order. A brief conversation, confirming what had already been confirmed. Nirvana at 8:30, changeover, Dylan at 10. One of Dylan's people, a man named Gerald, who had worked with him for years and whose precise role was never entirely clear to anyone outside the inner circle, looked up from his phone. Nirvana's on before Bob? That's right, Hale said. 8:30. Gerald looked at him for a moment. That's fine, he said, and went back to his phone. It was not fine. Dylan's sound check had gone long, and he was still working through something with his acoustic when word reached his side of the compound that Nirvana had taken the stage. The sound traveled easily across the open field. Dylan stopped playing. Not dramatically. He simply stopped, the way a person stops when they hear something unexpected in the middle of a quiet room. He held the guitar across his lap and listened. What was coming from the main stage was not what he had anticipated. He had assumed, in the loose, unexamined way that people assume things they have never bothered to question, that Nirvana would be loud and simple. He had heard "Smells Like Teen Spirit" once, or something like it, on a television in a hotel room. He remembered it as noise with a chorus. That was approximately his entire framework for what was about to happen in front of 10,000 people. What he was hearing was not that. He couldn't see the stage from where he was sitting. He could only hear it. And what he was hearing was, he didn't have a word for it immediately. He sat with the guitar in his hands and he listened, and he tried to find the word. Raw, maybe, but that wasn't quite right. Raw implied unfinished, and this didn't feel unfinished. It felt like something that had been stripped down deliberately until only the true thing remained. Like you had taken a sentence and removed every word that was doing anything other than necessary work. And what was left was just the point. Just the point of it, standing there alone, without anything around it. He didn't move for a while. At some point, the guitar slid off his lap and he set it carefully against the wall beside him and just sat with his hands open on his knees. Gerald was across the room doing something on his phone. Neither of them spoke. The sound from the main stage kept coming. Dylan had spent 30 years understanding what music could do. He had been called a prophet by people who meant it and a fraud by people who also meant it, and he had survived both. He knew what it felt like to hold a room with a single word, to make silence mean something. But what was coming through the wall was doing it differently. Not with language in the way he knew language, with something underneath it, something that didn't require the listener to follow or interpret. It was just there, like weather. Gerald noticed and said nothing. 40 minutes into Nirvana's set, Dylan stood up and walked toward the curtain that separated the two sections of the compound. Gerald watched him go. Dylan pulled back the edge of the curtain and looked across the 40 feet at the Nirvana section, which was now mostly empty. The band was on stage, and the people who traveled with them had drifted toward the stage side wings to watch. A couple of equipment cases sat open on the floor, a half-eaten plate of food on a folding table. He stood there for a moment, listening to the sound coming from the main stage. Then he let the curtain fall and walked back to his chair. "I need to talk to Patrick," he said. Gerald looked up. "Now?" "When he's available." Patrick Hale found Dylan backstage at 9:15, 15 minutes after Nirvana had finished their set. The crowd outside was still audible. That particular frequency of sound that 10,000 people make when they don't want a thing to be over. Dylan was sitting where he had been all evening. He looked, Hale thought, like a man doing quiet arithmetic in his head, working something out. "I want to change the order," Dylan said. Hale waited. "I want to go on before them." Hale stood very still. "They've already played." Dylan looked at him. "Next time," he said. "If there's a next time with both of us on a bill, I want to go on before them." Hale didn't know what to say to that. He said, "Okay." "Don't put me after that," Dylan said. It wasn't a complaint. It wasn't angry. It was just a statement of something he had apparently decided. It's not the right order." He picked up his guitar and turned back toward the stage. Hale stood in the compound alone for a moment, holding his clipboard. He walked outside and looked at the crowd. Dylan's performance that night was, by most accounts, excellent. He played with focus and purpose. The reviews the following week were respectful, as they almost always were. But the sound engineer who worked Dylan's monitors that evening, a man named Rick Tolan, who had been doing festival work for 15 years, said something years later that stuck with people who heard it. He said that between songs, when the crowd noise dipped, he could see Dylan listening, not to the monitors, not to the guitar in his hands, to something interior, like a man trying to hold a conversation in his head with an argument he had lost and hadn't finished processing. Tolan said he had worked with enough artists to know what that looked like. It looked like someone recalibrating. In 2003, 10 years after the Cascadia Festival, Dylan gave a long interview to a music journalist named Carol Ash, who was writing a retrospective piece about the American music landscape of the early 90s. Near the end, Ash asked him about Nirvana. Dylan was quiet for a long time before answering. "I heard them play from backstage once," he said. "I didn't watch. I just listened." Ash waited. "There are moments," Dylan said slowly, "when you hear something and you understand that the language has changed, not evolved, changed. It's a different thing. The rules you had been using, they're still valid, but they're not the only valid thing anymore. They're just one version of the valid thing." He stopped, seemed to be deciding whether to continue. "I had assumed," he said, "that I knew what was happening, with music, with where it was. I had a picture of it in my head, and then I heard that kid sing from 40 feet away through a wall, and the picture was wrong. The picture I had was just wrong." Ash wrote it down. She asked him what he meant. "I mean, I thought I knew the shape of the room," Dylan said. "And the room was bigger than I thought. That's all." Simone Reyes, the production assistant who had walked Kurt Cobain from his car to the compound, went on to work in music production for the next 2 decades. She told the story of that night occasionally, at industry events and in interviews. She always mentioned the same detail. The part where she asked him if there was anything he needed before he went on, standard question, last check before stage time, and he had looked at her with that unhurried underwater calm he seemed to carry around with him like a coat, and said, "I'm good." Nothing else. No nerves visible. No performance of confidence. Just settled. The way a person is settled when they are not thinking about how they appear, because they are thinking about something else entirely, something real. She said it was the most purely unself-conscious she had ever seen anyone be in the moments before walking out in front of 10,000 people. He wasn't performing being calm, she said. He was just calm. And then he went out there and played like the room was on fire. She also said something else in a later interview. She said that when she walked him back across the field after the set, sweaty, the cardigan gone, carrying nothing but a bottle of water, she had asked him how it went. He looked at her with the same unhurried expression as before. "It was okay," he said. Not false modesty, she decided eventually. Just the truth of how he experienced it. The show had been what it was. It was complete now. She thought about that a lot in the months after April 1994. Patrick Hale retired from festival production in 2011. He gave a long interview to an oral history project about the Pacific Northwest music scene, and someone asked him about the Cascadia Festival. He talked about the logistics, the weather, the lineup, and then he talked about that moment backstage. Dylan in the compound, the clipboard in his hands, the sound of 10,000 people outside who didn't want it to be over. He said, "Don't put me after that," Hale said. And I understood what he meant, but I also didn't understand it the way he understood it in that moment. The interviewer asked him what he thought Dylan had meant. Hale was quiet for a moment. "I think he meant that some things are not the right things to follow," he said. "Not because they're better or worse, just because they're complete, their own whole thing. And if you come after them, you're not starting fresh. You're starting from after them, and there's no way to make that comfortable." He paused. "Dylan figured that out in one night," Hale said, "standing in a barn, listening through a wall." Kurt Cobain died in April of 1994, 8 months after the Cascadia Festival. The footage from that night has never fully surfaced. A few handheld clips exist. Shaky, low resolution, the kind of thing that tells you the room was full, but doesn't tell you what it felt like to be inside it. What remains is the account. The account of a man with a long history of understanding exactly where he stood in the landscape of American music, standing still in a converted barn in August, listening to something come through the wall, and quietly deciding that he had been wrong about the shape of the room. He played his set. He played it well. He never talked about that night publicly. Just once in 2003 to Carol Ash. That single answer, careful and honest, and only half of what he might have said. "The language has changed. The picture I had was wrong. The room was bigger than I thought. That was all. That was enough."